Hello, you're listening to the Wall Street Window podcast. In a few moments, I'm going to have a very special guest on. I'm going to be speaking with JP Sottile, who runs the website newsvandal.com, and he also runs a daily email with links to the most important news articles he's keeping track of every single day. He's a journalist I follow. I'm on his email list, and I open and read this every single day. It's one of the most important emails I get. Now, he wrote an interesting article about the price of oil, and that's what I'm going to speak with him about. And as you know, this has been another wild week in the markets. It seems like we could say that every single week, but something truly unprecedented happened, and that is the price of West Texas Intermediate crude oil in the futures market fell so low that they went below zero. They went to a negative price, something that's never happened before in any commodity. It tells us that there's a complete collapse in demand, to say the least. In fact, there's now 1/3 less gasoline being used every single day than there was just a few weeks ago. In fact, you got to go back over 20 years to see this low level of usage for gasoline. It's quite remarkable because the country, of course, has grown in population and the economy over 20 years. So it's really 25 years is how far back you got to go. So pretty amazing. But there's geopolitical implications for all this too. And that's what his article's about. So one quick break, and then we'll be talking with JP Sottile about the geopolitical implications for oil. Is oil kicking the bucket?
Humans. Their nature demands competition, the rising tide of aggression shaping the world around us. Natural fear and disgust can overcome the ability to reason. Coping skills are left wanting. Carmine Savastano, Human Time Bomb, The Violence Within Our Nature, poses significant questions and considers the evidence that violence shapes the past and present. Human Time Bomb, The Violence Within Our Nature. Order your digital and print copies now on Amazon.com. For more information, visit tpaak.com. Carmine Savastano, Human Time Bomb.
Hey, how you doing today, JP?
I'm muddling through this incredible, it's like a surging sewer pipe of information that I'm trying to sort through.
Well, it's what everyone sort of feels like every day, and I think,
Yeah.
One day you try to tune it out. I think that's what a lot of people do. Then the next day they don't, and some people, that I know, they watch the Trump press conference every day, sort of. But you had a really interesting article that's not just noise a couple days ago about oil. I mean, we've seen what oil has done, but it's about the geopolitical implications of oil. Is oil kicking the bucket? I'll link to it with this so people can read it themselves. But I mean, it's more than just about oil dropping and the stock market, whatever moves, but it's about the geopolitical implications of it.
And they are significant. And Mike, you know where I come from, where I'm coming from on all of this, and have done for a long time. I think oil and energy is what underpinned Donald Trump's candidacy, what has underpinned his entire presidency. I think it's what his presidency has been predicated on from the beginning. I think that he was essentially hired by particularly the OPEC plus powers, that would be United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and certain oil and fracking interests in the United States, to scuttle the Iran nuclear deal, to make sure that their oil stays off the market, and to sustain an oil market that even prior to COVID-19, and that's what spurred this, was the amazing epical drop of oil into negative territory that would have been WTI, West Texas Intermediate, on the month-long contracts that were short sold by ETFs and whatnot, which created this weird dynamic. But oil has been in a chronic glut for a decade. And the glut really began in earnest in 2008 with the financial crisis, which ratcheted back on use of oil, oil consumption. But really, the oil glut, if you look at it over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, I think the oil glut has been going on since the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. And I think that the first Gulf War was a reflection of that glut. I certainly think that the war on Iraq was a reflection of the dynamics, the geopolitical dynamics of the oil glut, because at that time, at the end of Clinton's administration, oil's trading, at or around $20, sometimes under $20. And Iraq was increasingly in compliance with UN directives that came out of the first Gulf War. And as they were getting closer to being in compliance and on the verge of being in compliance, that's when you got 9/11, and then you got everything that happened after that. Well, Iraq at that time, their share of the world's oil reserves kept climbing every year as their oil stayed largely off the market outside of the Food for Oil program that, by the way, Halliburton was involved in, Halliburton being led by Dick Cheney at that time. And Saddam Hussein, who had an amazing grudge for understandable reasons against the Saudi Arabians, was making noises about not only trading his oil in euros, but was certainly making noises about flooding the market with oil as soon as he came in compliance. So before the UN could verify, UNSCOM could verify that he was in compliance, 9/11 happened. He doesn't trade it, his oil doesn't flood the market, and the Saudi Arabians get to preserve their grip on OPEC, because the more oil that you have to trade inside OPEC, the larger share of power you have. And right now, OPEC has been controlled by a tag team of the UAE and Saudi Arabia for the last 25, 30 years. And so I look back at most of the conflicts and geopolitical events of the last 40 years, 50 years, really my entire life, because it goes back to the oil shock after in 73, and then the Iranian hostage situation, and then that oil shock, and all of the geopolitical games and conflict hotspots of my lifetime have really centered around oil, and not just controlling oil resources and trying to capture oil resources, which is how I think many of us think of an empire of oil, as something that's motivated to go grab oil. That's how Trump thinks about it. Why didn't we take the oil? But that's not what the empire of oil is often about. It's often about making sure somebody's oil stays in the ground so that oil does not flood the market, driving the price of oil down below the break-even price, which now I'll try and wrap. I know I'm being long-winded here, but that's what's so relevant about what's happening now is we've had this oil glut in earnest since 2008, and it was exacerbated by then President Obama's drive to open up fracking in the United States, which drove oil down way below the break-even price into the 20s. Again, it was dropped again, which hammered the Saudi Arabian economy, hammered the Russian economy, hammered the Iranian economy, and hammered the Venezuelan economy. It helps. I think there's some case to be made that it helped drive Iran to the bargaining table to get that Iran nuclear deal and begin a potential denouement. But driving it below that break-even price, and that glut has been such a problem, particularly for the Saudis and the Russians. They've actually entered into an OPEC plus alliance. The first time Russia organized its production in accordance with Saudi-led OPEC production limits. And that was to try and artificially inflate the price of oil by reducing the amount of oil on market so that they could get it above the break-even price. Well, there's so much oil on the market that it's, oil even over the last 2 years has been hovering around the break-even price, which I think the Dallas Federal Reserve last year put it somewhere around $55. Well, oil has been bumping between $40 and $60 for the last couple of years after the initial Trump bump, when he became president and he started to introduce artificial scarcity principles like scuttling the Iran nuclear deal into the market, and that artificially inflated the price of oil. In addition, in concert with the first coordinated oil production cuts between Russia and Saudi Arabia, so they made some money for that period of time. But all of these moments of the oil price, the price of oil going above the break-even price, have reflected, by and large, manipulations of the market through geopolitical plays, through belligerence, war talk, through artificial scarcity by keeping somebody's oil in the ground, keeping Libya's oil in the ground by getting them involved in a long civil war, keeping Iraq's oil in the ground. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with all of this. And the way I look at the long-term trend is that oil itself is a commodity that is in deep, deep trouble. Because unlike, in sort of complete contraposition to the general idea that dominated much of the thinking about oil and geopolitics for 20 years, which was the coming of peak oil. Remember peak oil, Mike? Remember that?
Oh yeah. That was big 15 years ago or so.
Yeah.
Sure.
And it was big when leading into the second Gulf War, which is really what the Iraq War was. Leading into the Iraq War and after that came after 9/11, all the talk was peak oil. All the talk, we got to get more oil. And I think subconsciously it was a way of feeding the market and the American people an idea that, it actually is in our best interest to have Iraq as a client state because we need their oil because we're going to run out of oil. When really nothing could be further from the truth. Now, I know that the world is awash in oil, but a lot of it is not necessarily economically viable. Why? Because of break-even prices. And there might be a lot of oil in Indonesia, but it's expensive to extract. And it might not be the light sweet crude of West Texas Intermediate or Brent. Those are the two benchmark oils. Brent is the oil that comes out of the North Sea that Norway and Britain are extracting. I think Sweden also extracts a little bit of that. And then West Texas Intermediate is the benchmark that comes out of Texas. And these are light sweet crude oils, which means they have a low sulfur content and a low gravity. Gravity means the actual weight of the oil. The lower the gravity, the more it floats on oil. The higher the gravity, the more it sinks. It also means that it's not as easily refinable. It doesn't produce as much gas or chemical precursors for plastic or whatnot. The lighter the oil, the sweeter the crude, the less the sulfur, the easier it is to refine, and it makes it more valuable. So, but even though a lot of this is these discoveries can be below the break-even price, the simple fact of the matter is the world is awash in oil, and this is all happening against the backdrop not only of economic dislocations like 2008 and now COVID-19's dislocation, but of a growing dread about the coming of climate change and talk about carbon footprints and trying to reduce carbon footprints and things like what did that sort of ecological consciousness and fear of climate change do? It did things like create a huge market for the Toyota Prius. And what did the Toyota Prius do? Well, after years of the United States going full bore on SUVs to the point at which people were buying Hummers during the Iraq War.
The gas guzzlers.
Think about it. We were buying Hummers during the Iraq War. At the moment we were in an oil war to turn Iraq into a client state, go buy a Hummer. Go ahead, buy gigantic. Look at the domestic, they're called light duty trucks. But if you look at like a Dodge Ram or a full-size Ford truck and compare it to a full-size Ford truck in the 70s, there's no comparison. These things are behemoths, right? So, and that's one of the largest segments of the U.S. domestic auto market for U.S. makers. For Japanese makers like Toyota's had a huge success with the Prius. Well, what was it doing? It was getting 60 miles to the gallon. And so efficiency and technology were making making the oil glut more and more of a problem for major oil producers, petrostates that depended on oil, and for companies that traded in the oil that those petrostates produced, and that'd be a lot of U.S. makers and refiners. So we're in this perfect storm environment over the last decade where the oil glut is growing, new discoveries are coming online all the time. You have massive new discoveries in places like the Rakhine Basin in Myanmar. I mean, and this is also, by the way, with the Arctic melting because of climate change, ironically, opening up even more possibilities for future oil reserves. And we haven't even talked about methane hydrates on the ocean floor, which some people say could produce enough hydrocarbons to power an advanced global economy for centuries. So it's not that the peak oil thing is gone, and at the same time, you're starting to get more technology and a rising consciousness that says we need to do something about climate change, all intersecting at the same time. And so we are in, what I see is a chronic glut situation that does what? Makes geopolitical maneuvering and artificial scarcity manipulations of the market more and more likely to try and preserve the economic viability of the empire of oil.
Well, we've seen one just a few days ago.
Right.
Trump made tweets about these Iranian boats, and funny thing about it is the next day I saw articles in foreign policy journals saying he did it just to make the price of oil go up.
Yeah,
it's just,
Mike, that's the thing. It's not even hidden anymore. It's like it's so obvious at this point because of this chronic glut that we've been experiencing. And I think that that's one thing that this COVID-19 dislocation has done and that's what I wrote in that little analysis. It's only a few hundred words. But I wanted to get it out there, but I wanted to peg it because I want people to be aware that, that epic drop of WTI, West Texas Intermediate, last week to what the contracts were down to like negative $43. Like you had to pay somebody $43
you
to
never
take
seen
a
anything
delivery
like
of
it.
oil, right? Well, that was I understand that was in no small part driven by these oil ETFs that were shorting the market, but it was also a reflection that those shorts were a reflection of the problem of even a small disruption in demand, which is already tenuous as a hook for keeping the price of oil above the break-even price. Even a small dislocation of 6 weeks is basically death for the oil business. And so you could see why the Saudi Arabians have been so involved in Donald Trump's candidacy and presidency, because Donald Trump was one of the only things they had going for them in terms of trying to sustain the price of oil. Now, that break-even price being at around $55 is also death for a bunch of small, mid-size oil producers, fracking dependent often, in the Permian Basin in West Texas. And so, it's just such a fascinating thing to see.
I just did a thing. I started driving in 1991, and I remember the price of oil being the price of gas being about $1.
Yeah.
Let's say, and I maybe it was $1.05, something like that. But as we're speaking, I just went to a website and did the inflation adjusted amount today. Where I live, it's $1.71. If you inflation adjust that to 1991, you get 90 cents.
Wow. Right.
So the price of gas is the cheapest it's ever been in my lifetime, because that was actually the low that year I started driving. So pretty amazing.
and I think that's likely to be the case for a while. Now, what's going to happen? And before we came on the air, we were chit-chatting, doing a little crosstalk here on what's coming next. And I think we're both probably in agreement that there's not going to be like a jumper cable start to the economy. It's not like somebody's going to just turn it over and the engine's going to be running. It's going to be this patchwork of it's fits and starts here and there. And I can see the psychology of the market as soon as, let's say, particularly California says, well, we have limited openings of retail and restaurants in California, being because of just the sheer size and the history of it as a car state. More people buying gas. And here the price
Sure.
of gas hasn't dropped to $1 because the market can still sustain artificially high prices because, we're used to paying more than the rest of the country just because they can get away with it, because it's not, again, oil is like the least free market of all the free enterprise aspects of this economy. There's not a lot of free market happening in oil and gas, but I could see the price of oil jumping radically, right? Because people in the market act based not on fundamentals, they base on psychology. And if everybody decides that the price of oil should be higher, they're going to go, and then they'll try and they'll do profit taking once it gets to a certain point, and all that kind of stuff will happen. But all of these fluctuations are really sort of temporary situations on a long-term track. And I think the long-term track, particularly as NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is predicting that 2020 will be the hottest on record. 2019 was the hottest on record for Europe. The 5 of the like 7 hottest years ever were in the last 8 years. And climate change's impacts are going to start mounting, and I think the calls to do things about it are going to grow. I don't know if people are going to have, there's the boiling frog principle. In a way, we've been boiling frogs on climate, and somebody turned the water down on the frog. I mean, we're getting close to the boiling point, and just like that, COVID-19 comes and turns the heat off. And I don't know if, as the water gets a little cooler and we can see clearer air and see some of the positive environmental effects of not driving all the time, of not using hydrocarbons all the time, if when we kick it back in, if that's going to have a sort of a reinforcing impact on the desire to do something about climate change. Because really, climate change and its intersection with hydrocarbons is the epic battle of our time. And I look back at the 2000 election. At that time, I was at C-SPAN, and that was a crazy time to be at C-SPAN and have that front row seat. But if you look back and think at a historical fork in the road, imagine now, in retrospect, how different things might have been if you had Al Gore win, a man who had written Earth in the Balance and went on to do Inconvenient Truth. Now, Earth in the Balance was in 93, I think, or 92 he wrote that. So the difference between Al Gore and a thoroughly oil-soaked presidential candidate like Bush, think about that bifurcation, that possible alternative universe that might have been with somebody who was not as wholly committed to sustaining the oil and gas industry like George W. Bush was. And we kind of have a similar thing happening on a much smaller level in a way with Clinton and Trump. But Trump is wholly committed to the oil and gas industry, to the extent to which he is actually scuttling CAFE standards for cars, trying to eliminate the gas efficiency standards for cars, trying to eliminate air pollution standards, trying to eliminate all of the environmental protections, any environmental protection, I should say, that has any potential impact on the bottom line of oil and gas and the break-even price and its intersection with the break-even price. So I look politically and geopolitically and see that the larger battle here is between a human civilization that is at a potential nexus point maybe even an inflection point is a better way of saying it, between a century of hydrocarbon dominated geopolitics and economics and a new economic paradigm that would be post hydrocarbon that would develop over the course of the next 10 to 15, 20 years. And oh, by the way, Germany, they're leading the world in wind now, and they've been phasing out coal, they've been phasing out hydrocarbons. Scotland is a place where they're getting a huge portion of their energy mix now from wind and renewables. Britain is building wind like crazy. There are massive wind farms going up in Texas, and Iowa is the country's leader in wind energy production. I mean, and now I'm not saying that those things don't have environmental costs, because they do. Solar panels, if you built a giant solar farm in the East Mojave Desert, for example, you're going to radically alter an ecosystem there, and there is going to be fallout. Animals are going to die from that. So I'm not trying to present a rosy picture of solar and oil and versus oil, or gas for wind versus oil and gas, but I'm saying that economically, because the price per megawatt hour for these sources is now often at or below hydrocarbons, definitely below coal, and in some places it's competing with oil and gas for electricity production. Price per megawatt hour dropping below, cheaper to use solar or wind than coal and natural gas. That is another unsustainable problem for countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Russia, United Arab Emirates, and of course for the dominant oil and gas industry of the United States.
Well, yes, this is about oil. You mentioned the peak oil thing, and there was a movie, and I got it upstairs, a documentary made around that time, and it was called Collapse, and I can't remember the person's name, but it was centered around kind of like a conspiracy theorist character. He ended up killing himself years later, but he was basically making the claim that almost like one day you're going to wake up and the oil is going to run out and so forth. But one thing
that's Michael Rupert.
Yeah, him. That's him. Right.
Michael Rupert. Yeah, who killed himself. He was in Venezuela, I think, right? Living in exile because he was doing some 9/11 stuff, and he'd been an LA police officer who actually did some interesting investigative work on trying to uncover CIA cocaine rings and whatnot. And so, yeah.
Well, the documentary, it was done very well, and it was pretty convincing for a piece of a movie. But one of the interesting things that showed was oil is used in everything, for agriculture and fertilizer and so forth. So then you can imagine, well, if it's used in everything, not just cars, then maybe we can run out. But then I remember somebody else years before him making these claims that oil will never run out because it's just so much of it in the ground and things are decaying all the time. So at the same time, I've seen studies several years ago, because I had been involved in a chain of body shops, and that industry, we got some reports from, I can't remember if they're some companies involved in body. I don't remember if it was a paint company, tire company, whatever it was, but they were projecting that the use of automobiles and the miles being driven would actually decline over the decades. And so with the use of gasoline. So anyway, just from cultural trends, younger people not wanting to drive as much, people using more, using less gas and more electricity in the cars, as you just mentioned. But assuming the car stuff, is being used less, and the demand for energy from oil is used less, could it still run out because of the food problem?
I really don't think so. I mean, not based on, well, I mean, it depends.
Or is
See,
it just
here,
so plentiful that
it is
what does it matter?
plentiful.
You know,
I mean,
it's always being renewed. I don't know. I'm just not the
it
expert
is,
on
well, it is
it.
plentiful. And don't underestimate things like the Arctic region.
Yeah.
That being able to, the warming in the Arctic region is insane. And there is this, it is a fascinating, now I'm just going to say this because if you wanted to put on your tinfoil hat, you would say that one of the reasons why big oil has spent so much time and spent so much money and put so much energy into climate denialism is because they want the climate to heat up to thaw out the Arctic ice cover so that they can get into the Arctic Ocean and tap the oil and mineral reserves. There are also mineral reserves, but the oil reserves that they know or suspect is there, but they couldn't get to with that massive ice cover. So you get rid of the ice cover, and wow, you got more oil, right? So that would be a highly tinfoil hatted way of looking at it. But it's actually true. And by the way, Russia and China are now in preliminary oil exploration ventures in the Arctic region, and ventures that could not have taken place 20 years ago when there was a thicker ice cover, more persistent. So there is a lot of oil out there. I mentioned the Rakhine Basin, or Rakhine, I think is how it's said in Myanmar, which is the nation formerly known as Burma. And so the Rakhine Basin has a massive reserve. It was the block rights to it was purchased by Chevron. Chevron has been involved in Myanmar and Burma for years. They actually got sued, taking over when they merged with Unocal, because Unocal was involved in a slave labor problem in building pipelines in Myanmar, Burma, in the 90s, and they were ready to exploit this. But what's happened in Myanmar? You've had this massive problem with the Rohingya. Well, where are the Rohingya? The Rohingya predominantly lived in the Rakhine State, which bordered on and overlapped with the Rakhine Basin, where this massive oil and gas reserve was. And I don't think the two things are unrelated. And I think Chevron finally, over time, they just decided I think last I saw, they were trying to auction off their rights about a year ago because it was just becoming a big geopolitical hassle for them, a big PR hassle for them. And so you have there's a reserve that's not going to be exploited, not really because of financial issues, direct financial issues in terms of the exploration and extraction side, but because of the mess that's going on in Myanmar. So there's oil and gas that's just going to sit there and not be exploited. And that's happening all over the world. People don't realize Vietnam is sitting on a bunch of stuff. The South China Sea, remember the South China Sea was in the news forever there, Mike?
Oh yeah.
Well, why? You go around the Spratly Islands, massive oil and gas reserves. And who is competing over that? China with all these Southeast Asian powers. And who has got their nose in there? The United States. Why is the United States constantly challenging China on the South China Sea? By the way, it's the South China Sea. So here's the United States saying, China, we don't want you doing anything in the South China Sea, just like the United States, is trying to modulate what the Persians are doing in the Persian Gulf. Anyway, I just find those things funny. But what if China was suddenly able to exploit a massive oil and gas reserve in the South China Sea? What would that do? Well, that would certainly modulate the power of the United States and its number one partner. I don't even say Saudi Arabia is America's client, because I think in many ways it's a partnership. It's not, they take turns being each other's client. But Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, one of their main markets for their product is China. And what does that do? So the United States has the Fifth Fleet based in the Persian Gulf to do what? To make sure that oil and gas gets from the Persian Gulf, from the United Arab Emirates, and from Oman and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and that gets to China to do what? To feed China's industrial giant. And what does China's industrial giant do? It feeds the profit margins of U.S. corporations who exploit cheap Chinese production and manufacturing to create huge profit margins by selling cheap widgets often plastic widgets to the American people, which the American people buy on credit, which feeds the U.S. Financial industry. And interestingly enough, the plastic in those plastic widgets comes from what? Oil. So, you know, the thoroughgoingness of oil as a part of every part of our economy is not debatable. The end of oil, though, is not coming anytime soon. And as climate change consciousness, for lack of a better word, continues to rise, because there was the poll numbers on climate have moved radically over the last 4 or 5 years. So the climate denialism, I look at hundreds of articles every day and have done for 10 years straight on doing the rundown. And the number of climate denial articles that I see out of right-wing media has declined precipitously. They almost don't exist anymore. Now what I'm seeing is, and actually Dan Crenshaw, the sort of superstar military veteran out of Texas for the Republican Party. He's a congressman. He's the guy who Pete Davidson made a joke about on Saturday Night Live, and then Pete Davidson apologized to him, and the way Crenshaw handled it was, with great aplomb, and it raised his cred with the conservative movement, and they like him because he's cool looking with a patch on his eye as a military veteran who stood up for the country, and he's got a nice measured approach. He's their next sort of their superstar that they're grooming. He actually wrote a piece for the National Review about 10 or 11 days ago that said that the GOP has to get out in front of climate change now. And what I'm seeing now coming out of particularly National Review and some of the more mainstream conservative press is we have to offer, not alter, but alter may actually work too. We have to offer free market solutions to climate change, which we have to alter the free market, I guess is a way too. But so they're actually trying, and Tom Ridge just wrote a piece on Earth Day, former governor of Pennsylvania, former head of Homeland Security under George W. Bush, wrote a piece about how the GOP is lagging on environmental issues. So that tells me that this thing is growing, and this is actually something that I think the Saudi Arabians have been concerned about forever. I think the Russians have been concerned about forever, because if the United States goes green in a significant way, not in a greenwashing way, it's really going to, the glut that we have now, where you have tankers sitting off of the coast of California at hundreds of thousands of dollars a month to just keep oil stored in tankers, because that's really what drove the price drop last week, was storage capacity. Everything is at capacity. Everything is filled with oil. And so you think about it, you have millions of barrels of oil coming out of the ground every day, and millions of barrels of oil sitting in storage, and no place to put the oil coming out of the ground. And then if you don't have people using oil because the economies are on pause, that on pause that we're experiencing now, I could project out in 10 years, if you had a massive transformation of the energy use of major industrial economies towards renewable resources, I could see that this would be the new normal. This is a preview of the new normal, which means what? Which means the price of oil is never going to get above the break-even price, and so you have a major financial crisis facing the oil and gas industry.
Well, I'm sure the princes in Saudi Arabia wouldn't like this message getting out.
No, and that's what they love. That's why they love Boy Donnie, right? Shoot down those boats. Isn't that what he said? To shoot down like they're flying boats.
Yeah.
Look, and folks, this is of your primary interest. That you are an expert, Mike, on U.S. empire. And there's nothing more inexorably intertwined than oil and the American empire. Those two things are symbiotic. And this is this paradigm that we are talking about is also an existential threat to U.S. empire. And that means it's a threat to the military-industrial complex, because a huge rationale for the military-industrial complex and defense spending over the last 50 years has been the protection of the hydrocarbon-based economy globally.
And it's a bipartisan thing. I mean, you
Yes.
go back to Jimmy Carter, and he had his Gulf doctrine. I
Yep.
think that's what he called it. You know, just he in a sense he started it
Yep.
in the Persian Gulf. I mean, the Empire Oil you're talking about goes all the way back, I would say, to Roosevelt. And
Roosevelt meeting
World War
with
II, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Right. So, and I don't know, where this is going to go, because I don't. Can the princes in Saudi Arabia survive with
No, they
oil this
can't.
low?
They can't, Mike, because the final year of Obama's presidency. Now, remember, the Saudis hated Obama. Remember, he flies to Saudi Arabia and they wouldn't even meet him on the tarmac. This is the first, they broke a protocol that had gone back to that meeting on a boat between FDR and the king of Saudi Arabia. They broke a protocol by not having any high-level official come out and greet the U.S. president as he flew to when he landed in Saudi Arabia. They despised Obama. And why? Because of fracking and because of Iran. And the two-pronged strategy of disrupting the Saudis and the Russians, I think, were the primary targets, and the ancillary targets of Venezuela and Iran, but really hitting Saudi Arabia and Russia with fracking, which drove both of those economies into deep trouble. Russia's economy was contracting at one point, and Saudi Arabia in that final year before Trump was elected they were not paying some of their civil servants. They had run out of money, which leads to what? Leads to MBS.
Coups, arrest.
Those arrests, what were those arrests and the shakedowns at the Ritz-Carlton? They needed money. They needed money. He was actually shaking down princes so that they could pay people, so they could keep, because one of the things that keeps Saudi Arabia going is its massive kind of Keynesianism, where they pay a huge class of civil servants, where they're able to pay workers and pay the underclass, because there's basically an underclass in Saudi Arabia. You have the princes and all the connected family members and the people who are in the businesses connected to the family. Then you have another level of Saudi citizen who depends on the largesse of the state. And so they're kind of paying a huge portion of their people to not revolt against this incredible two-tiered system of elite wealth that is being sustained by the Saudi oil economy. So they use what? They use a combination of subsidized housing and subsidized everything that's paid for by the oil industry, and they use Wahhabi Islamic radicalism to keep their population in line while they jet around the world, drive fast cars, snort cocaine, and bang white Western women. So that paradigm was in deep jeopardy during the second Obama administration, and that paradigm was saved by the election of Donald Trump.
And now we'll end up seeing where it goes in the next 2 or 3 years, I guess.
Yeah.
So where everything goes, the whole world for that matter. Well, I know I've kept you a long time, so I'll
actually, Mike, I think I've kept you a long time.
No. Okay.
I'm sorry for going on it.
No.
It's always great.
That's what happens when I start talking with you. But thanks for taking the time to talk to me and everyone else. Everyone, check out your website, subscribe to your newsletter at newsvandal.com.
Take care, Mike.
Thank you.